presume. Yes, Mr. Commissioner, J.K. Lowes for the BC Wildlife Federation and the BC Federation of Drift Fishers. And I know I'm the last one on the afternoon, and you're probably getting tired, so I'm...
Well, I'm not sure Mr. Lowes is the last for the afternoon. He has half an hour, and I think we'll continue right till the end of the day.
All right. So much for my sweet talking of the witnesses. I'd like to start with Dr. Richards. Dr. Richards, the Commissioner is going to be faced with a mound of scientific evidence as a result of these hearings, and in particular scientific papers. I'd like you to step back a bit and speak about science generally to the Commissioner, and I'd like to hear your evidence on the use and particularly the limits on the kind of scientific evidence that's been led here, and in particular the limits on computer modeling. So the limits on scientific, what can science deliver and what can't it deliver to the Commission as distinct from the Department, and what in particular limits there are on computer modeling.
Okay, Mr. Commissioner, this is a fairly broad topic. I'm not quite sure exactly how to proceed with answering this in the time we have available. But let me just start by saying that, I mean, science proceeds often through hypothesis testing. You try to then go out and get as much data as you can to verify your various hypotheses. A lot of the evidence that we have comes from long-term monitoring series, which we've continued on some time. And given that we've got long time series of data, we're able to see whether patterns are repeatable and consistent. And one of the factors we're looking at here is we have a number of different CUs for sockeye and a number of different stocks, and so we're obviously interested to look for comparisons amongst these and to see and looking for long time series of data. We're also interested in comparing what's going on there with other stocks of salmon, other stocks of sockeye, and so certainly comparison is one of the main tools that we use. In the context more specifically of computer modeling, I think anytime we do a model, you could think of it perhaps more generally as a bit of a thought experiment. That models can be a very useful way to assemble your ideas and to allow you then, given a certain set of assumptions, to ask questions like, what if? So if I make certain assumptions here, I can end up with certain patterns, and then I can sort of probe my knowledge around certain assumptions and then say, well, if the world were actually like X, and that happened, what would be the consequences under this particular system I have built? But models are just that. They're thought experiments. They're not, you have to be very careful, and I think it's often a bit dangerous. You don't want to fall in love with your model. And so you need to be very careful to step back and look at it with a bit of a dose of reality, because any simplification is necessarily built on some assumptions, and the world can sometimes throw some big surprises at us, and we can be dealing with things that are very much outside of the world that we built in our model. So it's very important in science to always be looking to see whether there is something unusual, to see whether there is something that's different. And when we see, often models will help us and to suggest areas where we could do some more experiments that would either help us say, well, yeah, this continues to make sense, or say, no, there's something else that we need to add and to look in. Another thing that we can do is often, in addition to this, we will work with data, and often in the context of doing a model, you're trying to base it on some data series or data that you may have collected. And one of the obvious decisions that you have to make when you do that kind of analysis is you need to think about how the data are constructed that would go into that analysis. There's usually some initial decisions that you make, maybe because of expediency, maybe because of ease or simplification, about selecting certain data sets or certain parts of a data series. And certainly when you make that selection, that can have quite a great determination on the outcome and the endpoint that you reach with your analysis. And it's sometimes you may not even be so aware of that when you're doing, because you can sort of get wrapped up in the data and the analysis that you've done with the data that you selected. So you can end up thinking that you've got some kind of trend, but that may, you might have come up with a different conclusion if you'd had earlier data or done some other selection of your data. Now, another aspect here too, when we're going forward, is to think about the whole issue of prediction. Obviously, in this context, prediction is very much of interest. And again, prediction is very challenging. We're not nearly as good as the weather forecaster in doing the prediction, and we know how wrong that is. And to some extent, this is because we use models which are based on what happened on history. So we can say, well, if tomorrow is like what it was yesterday, then we may be doing okay in terms of what our prediction is, or we can perhaps do a better job. But sometimes things get thrown at you. Sometimes the unexpected happens, and if in that context, you can be very much thrown off, and you could be very wrong in terms of your prediction. Now, one of the other things that we've thought about too is well, maybe we just need to do more research, and we can get all the answers, and we can improve our uncertainty. Well, that's also not the way that science works. Fortunately, sometimes things are just hard, and we can put a lot of effort into a problem, and we could end up going down some kind of wrong turn, or you don't often tend to hear a lot about the negative things that happen with science, but often you can go down a road, and that doesn't really lead to a helpful answer in the end. Or you could get something which would be extremely helpful to you. So it's often hard to prejudge in advance how something is going to turn out. So you can hope, and you can work, and you could try to advance things quickly. You always want to try to make progress, but it is challenging, and sometimes you may not even have the right tool to look at certain kinds of questions. Perhaps some other kind of technology will come along that will enable you more quickly to come to some answers that you wouldn't otherwise had access to. So that's a bit of a ramble. I'm not quite sure where you wanted me to go with that.
Well, that's not where I wanted you to go. I just wanted you to help I just wanted you to help the commissioner. So if I've got you right, is it fair to call science a formalized thinking process? It's a way of thinking, or a way of...
Well, I mean, I think that science is, it's more than thinking. Science is a line of inquiry.
Right.
Science is setting up of even things like standards and procedures. So it's quite broad, and I think depending on how you look at it, it could be taken in some different contexts.
But it's one source of a number of sources of information for this commission.
Yes.
And some other sources would be the judgment, common sense, and even intuitions of experienced fish managers and scientists, and even users of the resource.
Well, one thing that science does tell us is sometimes your intuition is wrong.
Yes, and sometimes it's right.
And sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's right, but sometimes it's wrong. And so I think you have to be very careful to keep an open mind when you're doing science.
Yeah, absolutely. And but you would agree that the input from experienced people in fisheries biology, fisheries management, and the institutional wisdom of institutions such as the DFO and the Pacific Salmon Commission are also sources of information, along with the kind of science that the Commission has heard.
I think we need to take it's very important, I think, to take a broad context and to look at things from different perspectives and different angles.
And a question that the Commissioner asked of one of the witnesses, and it was essentially, what is meant by terms like likely and unlikely as hypotheses, and how is the Commissioner to use those kind of terms in deciding the kind of questions that are asked of him?
Well, that is a good question, and for which
It's not mine, it's the Commissioner's.
Unfortunately, there isn't one answer, because often in certain circumstances there will be very clear and precise definitions. Certainly, for example, on the wording of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they have used those words, they have used them with very formal definitions. In the context where we have been writing where I have been writing briefing notes, I think it was less formally meant, in that rather than the same formal definition that was used in some places, I think our terminology has been a little bit more loose, but is just based on the balance of evidence.
And as a general approach, I understand that science or the strength is essentially in discarding hypotheses rather than proving hypotheses. Is that fair enough?
That is certainly one way in which science proceeds.
And
there's some different theories about how to proceed with science. That is one of them.
All right. And should likely, unlikely, etc., be taken in that kind of context?
Well, I think in the context that we're looking at here, we were often saying, we were really looking for explanations that could cause, I think, the magnitude of change in the population that we saw in 2009. So when we're looking at some possibilities, it was not to say that we couldn't have had deaths of individual fish through one source or another source, but we were trying to look at what made sense to us from a population level.
So they're terms that are used at a pretty high level of generality.
So they were really used in a bit more general context than they might have been in, say, in the scientific literature.
Thank you. Mr. Bevan, in relation to monitoring, you described the recreational fishery as low risk. What do you mean by low risk?
If you have low fishing power and reasonable conservation ethic, then that means that you're not likely to have a pulse of fishing power that's so significant and relevant to the stocks being targeted that there could be a significant change in the population level very quickly, and so quickly, in fact, that management may be unable to respond in time.
Right.
So the risk is relevantly low compared to something like a seine fleet with a lot of fishing power, and particularly if you're looking at high power fishing capacity on a finite or limited number of fish, that becomes a real high risk that has to be very carefully managed.
Right, and the recreational fishery has that sort of low power and good ethic.
Generally, there's a lot of conservation concerns on the part of people who go and use this fish for recreational purposes. They want to have that conserved. It doesn't mean there aren't real problem people in it, but there's a community that has some significant track record in terms of conservation efforts and rebuilding efforts, etc. And
pretty well organized for the size of it.
In the context of British Columbia, yeah, I'd say that's correct.
Yeah. And Ms. Farlinger, along the same lines, during the discussion or the panel on the recreational fishery, one of the managers described the recreational fishery, and in particular the Sports Fishing Advisory Board, of the standard for good consultation. Would you agree with that proposition?
I think that the Sport Fish Advisory Board is one model that allows the recreational fishing community to get to its constituency. I think that we've certainly had lots of complaints from recreational fishers about the number of meetings and you know, sort of practical issues around it. But I think it's fair to say that the Sport Fish Advisory Board has made some significant efforts to ensure that they hear from their constituency, and that is certainly a mark of a good advisory process.
And the community generally, and the board is also helpful in communicating information from the department to their constituency. Is that right?
They are, whether they support the department's decision or whether they don't. Yes.
Staying with you, Ms. Farlinger, I asked Mr. Shamoot to describe generally, or to agree with me in describing generally the political climate, if you want to put it that way, but the changes other than biological or environmental that took place over the 80s and 90s. And I want to go through the list and just get the sense of whether these are changes which either, in your view, were significant at the time or perhaps still are. You've got a full plate, and I wanted to describe the plate that was in front of Mr. Shamoot. The first change I understand was, or the first one that I'm going to refer to, is a shift in responsibility for setting escapement goals and harvest rates from the Pacific Salmon Commission to the Government of Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Is that correct?
The domestic management of the fishery is done by Canada, although the specific management, that is the high-level management decisions about how much fish is available to catch, are done by in the Fraser Panel waters for pink chum by the Commission.
Yeah, that's the current regime, but
yes.
There was a change in that regime in the late early 90s. I don't have the date, but in and around that period. The responsibility went from the Salmon Commission to Canada.
Okay, I don't think I would be the right person to ask about that, as I was not involved in salmon management in the late 80s. But.
All right. The other was another was the 1987 rebuilding program.
Yes.
The Aboriginal fishing strategy was introduced in 1992.
Yes, that was an important change.
And the early 90s saw the appearance of significant or substantial differences between estimates, DBEs.
DBEs, I'm sorry.
Well, differences between the estimates of the returning fish at Mission and the estimates of the returned fish on the spawning grounds.
There's certainly, over a long period, were concerns about the counts on the spawning grounds and discrepancies between that and the counts at Mission. Yeah.
And significant fleet restructuring. I think you mentioned the Mifflin plan. That happened in and around the mid-90s.
Yes, there was a significant amount of effort, time, and resources put into the restructuring of the commercial fleet.
Yeah, and I think you said in answer to somebody's question that the driving force of that restructuring was essentially the reallocation of the access?
No, I want to be clear to separate those two things. The reduction of the fleet by in the order of 50% in the Mifflin plan, and I guess it would be in the late 90s, and then the Canadian Fishery and Adjustment and Restructuring Plan was focused on reduction of effort for conservation. And I think Mr. Bevan can certainly refer to the international direction with respect to that, but it was also an economic issue aimed at viability of the commercial fishery.
Yeah, I'm not interested in the detail. I just want to get the big picture of what the dynamics looked like through the 80s and 90s from the perspective of the fish managers.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to be clear that there is a difference in the programs that support the increase in Aboriginal participation in the commercial fishery and the reduction of the fleet. They are two different things for different reasons.
Understand.
Yeah.
Again, Ms. Farlinger, you've used the term common property resource a couple of times, and you referred to the Laroque case, and you talked about the introduction from the AFS. Where do you, as the RDG, get your update on the law that pertains to your department, and how do you disseminate it throughout the region? I'm not looking for a sense of whether you understand it or not, or whether we would agree with it or not, but in terms of the process, how do you get it, and what do you do with it?
Fundamentally, the Department of Justice provides advice to the department, that is the deputy, on court decisions. And there is consideration of that in terms of potential program changes or any other issue, any change in how the department conducts its work. That's done in consultation with the regions, and at that point the department decides how the advice from Justice on the case law is dealt with in terms of legal risks and the implementation of programs.
And how does it get passed down to the on-the-ground managers?
There's a variety of ways, but generally speaking through policy documents or updates.
One of you, and my note unfortunately doesn't say which one, used the happy phrase, the user groups need to understand each other's perspective. Do you recall who said that?
I don't, but I agree with it.
You agree with that? Well, this is not simply another objective that is desirable. This is really the sine qua non of whether we move forward in terms of achieving the objectives of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, isn't it?
That's true.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Bevan, in a pretty blunt way, said the alternative is pretty draconian measures by the minister. Is that?
If there's a consensus, the minister will take that very significantly into consideration. Almost inevitably will follow the consensus. In the absence of consensus, the minister is in an unenviable position of having to take a decision and impose it on the players. Now, we still consult, etc., but that means that the minister is the one who has to make the final call.
Okay. Am I right in my understanding that it's the intent of Strategy 4 of the wild salmon policy to provide a forum for that kind of mutual understanding of each other's perspectives and input into the department's thinking?
I think that's a fair statement. It's also, as the policy is itself, a statement of the way consultation was evolving, as well as an intention to move forward with that principle.
Now is Strategy 4 a decision-making process, or is it a process to design a decision-making process? Do you understand the distinction?
I hope I do. I think that the intention of Strategy 4 is to ensure that we provide the minister or decision makers with the best possible advice. And we believe, as embodied in Strategy 4, that that can be done where people can, who are concerned about the matters surrounding Pacific salmon, share each other's views and perspectives.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as if progress on Strategy 4 is not dependent on completions of Strategies 1, 2, and 3. Shouldn't Strategy 4 be emphasized to get the to get the understanding between user groups, or amongst user groups, and between the user groups and the department?
It's certainly true that a common understanding of information is a very useful tool in bringing groups together, and there are often dramatic differences within and between groups in terms of understanding status of stocks or the science around that. And I think we have focused our effort in particular on Strategy 1, but the reality is we need to use integrated processes as well to develop the fishing plans annually. So it's both a long-term process that should benefit from better information and a short-term process that we need to use annually to plan the fisheries.
My understanding of the evidence that I've heard is that, putting aside the long-term decline issues and the uncertainty issues, the department is faced with three current and urgent conservation-related management problems, that being the early Stewart, the early migrating late runs, and the Cultus Lake. Is that correct?
Those are certainly three important issues pertaining to these stocks. Yeah.
And with respect to the early Stewart, my understanding too is that that's a discrete stock that can, because of its timing, it's the first sockeye here in, can be relatively isolated and managed as a discrete stock. Is that correct? And it is, in fact.
It certainly has some advantages in timing over some of the other stocks, but there are a significant number of First Nations in particular who have harvested that stock historically and so have an interest in that stock. So there, even though that is a relatively contained problem, as you point out with respect to timing, there still are a large number of First Nations groups who have an interest in it. So it still is complex in terms of the decisions that need to be made around.
That's where the demand is within the First Nations groups.
At the moment, yes.
And am I correct that the Cultus has some similarities to the early Stewart in that it's essentially at the tail end of the summer, and again is a stock that is relatively discrete and separate?
As I think the fisheries managers testified in certainly more detail, the Cultus Lake stock is considered as part of the late stocks, and one of the trends we have seen more recently is shifts in timing, and of course that's what we're testing for in season, is when stocks are coming through.
And with respect to the early migrating late runs, I'm assuming that you've had some regard to Dr. Woody's substantial amount of evidence in these proceedings. He has an analysis and a diagnosis and a prescription for how to manage that problem.
Personally, I have not seen Dr. Woody's evidence, but I expect it is is known to managers, and they would be considering it.
Yeah. And I'm going to suggest that we've heard lots of evidence of trade-offs within the context of the wild salmon policy. Isn't the Cultus stock a prime candidate for a case study on the trade-off process?
It's certainly a weak stock whose harvest rate limits access to other more productive stocks, and so could be the subject of a study.
Now, my last, I think I've got a minute. I want to read you the last paragraph. I won't take you to it, of Exhibit 185, which is a document that Mr. Harvey referred to in his questions. And so I don't leave you out, Ms. Dansereau, perhaps I'll put this question to you. The paragraph reads this: among other things, the policy is guided by the principle that the fishery is a common property resource to be managed for the benefit of all Canadians, consistent with conservation objectives, the constitutional protection afforded Aboriginal and treaty rights, and the relative contributions that various users of the resource make to Canadian society, including socio-economic benefits to communities. Do you see that as the paradigm within which you discharge your responsibilities?
To a large extent, yes.
Sorry?
To a large extent, yes. That is, it is a common property resource, and we establish the rules to make sure that it is shared in the best way possible.
Other members of the panel, is Ms. Farlinger, is that the correct paradigm as you understand it for you doing your job?
I think that the fundamentally the regulatory job or the strategic outcomes that are identified by the department set the direction for how we operate generally in that context you just described.
Yeah. Mr. Bevan?
I agree with the statements made by the other witnesses.
And Dr. Richards?
I think I will defer to the other witnesses since this is a management question.
Okay.
Mr. Commissioner, John Galis for Western Central Coast Salish First Nations. I'm cognizant of the time, and I'm going to actually give the panel some homework, I think, that to think about tonight, and then I'll have some more substantive questions for them tomorrow. Just to let the panel know, the First Nations that I represent are Cowichan, Penelakut, Chemainus, Hulitsum, and the members of the Tumuk Treaty Association. Now, I want to start off with the wild salmon policy, and I think I heard from the witnesses earlier in the week that the genesis of this policy was the new directions document from 1998. Is that correct?
It was the new directions policy document that first stated publicly that the department would write a wild salmon policy.
Okay. And there were a series of reports from the Commissioner of the Environment that followed up on that. And I think the latest one was 2004, the push to the wild salmon policy.
I'm not sure, but reports from the Commissioner on the Environment do provide us with direction.
Okay, thank you. If we could just bring up Exhibit 8, please, Mr. Lynn. Page 7. So this is the homework for the panel. I just want to take you to a quote there. It starts with the successful implementation. And it provides the successful implementation of this policy will provide Canadians with healthy, diverse, and abundant wild salmon populations for future generations, sustainable fisheries to meet the needs of First Nations and contribute to the current and future prosperity of all Canadians, improved accounting for ecosystem value in salmon and habitat management decisions. I have one question for you on that. Perhaps Ms. Dansereau? I don't want to call you the deputy. It sounds like I'd be the sheriff in that case. Would you characterize these as the pillars of the wild salmon policy?
I think those who were there at the drafting of this policy would be better suited to answer that question, but I think they are central statements to the policy as it currently stands.
You'd agree that these three goals, I suppose maybe is a better word, they're fundamental to the success of this policy.
Well, they're certainly fundamental at the direction that the policy is trying to go to, because they will provide Canadians with, so it's more of a directional statement.
Okay. I know the time, Mr. Commissioner. I think I'll adjourn until tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Hearing is now adjourned until 10 o'clock tomorrow.